About 9 months ago, me and my partner had just bought a new 6-month-old boxer dog to keep our 3-year-old Labrador company and decided it would be a good idea to take them for a walk in the countryside. We live close to a large city called Hull in northeast England and decided to go for the walk in a ruralish area north of the River Humber that ran through to the sea. Upon getting to a village close to a local landmark, a World War II Army fort, we decided to walk close by and through the small patches of forest close to the nature reserve. We walked along a grass bunker toward the forest, and suddenly my partner pointed out 2 young men had began walking up the bank from the woods in a diagonal manner as if they were trying to cut us off. From close by, I wondered if the young men were attending some sort of World War II reenactment, as they were both wearing camouflage pants and were also covered in dust and dirt. I thought nothing of them both, as I was sure that they would pass us by, but as they grew closer, it appeared they were aimingly walking towards us. They were at least 10 feet away when they stopped, and one of them spoke up. The way he spoke still bothers me to this day, as he seemed to have a disregard for manners or even trying to make sense. The young man wanted to know where we were planning on walking, and we told him we were not really sure and would just see where we ended up. The young man looked disappointed by this and suggested we take his route, which went through the forest to what he described as a great place to sightsee and sit, as there were benches to sit down. While the young man was telling us about this, the other boy kept watch of our 2 dogs almost constantly, as if he wanted to make sure they were always in his sight at all time. We didn't have much knowledge of this area and had not seen any other dog walkers, so we took the young man's advice after they pointed to an opening in the woods, and so we walked on. The woods cast out about 30% of the sunlight, and as I looked back, I saw that the young man had not walked off, but were watching us walk into the forest. The track looked as though it was man-made, as it seemed to be the only walkable area throughout that forest. About 2 minutes into the trek, our Labrador began sniffing behind a bramble bush, which at first we thought nothing of, as both dogs sniff everywhere they can when we walk them, but however she began sniffing in one spot and rolling on the floor. We went over to her and saw she began sniffing some sort of shattered rubber pig mask with brown-red liquid on it. It looked disgusting, and my partner forced the dog away from it as it looked as though flies were crawling all around it. Further into the walk, the woods had turned into a long path of trees and bushes that become very narrow, but we could see a turn far ahead, and we agreed that if it led nowhere, we would turn back. I walked ahead and was on my phone preparing to take a photo of the woods when I felt several small pricks in my neck, chin, and part of my face. I let out a gasp to alert my partner, and he told me to stand still in an alarmed way, followed by him carefully removing thin pieces of string away from my face. As it turned out, someone had tied fishing hooks on lines to a tree in the walkway. It's safe to say that we were both terrified, confused, and angry after this point, and hurried back to the car and left back to home. I don't want to sound cliche or anything, but as we drove off, I swear I could see someone through the back mirror, peeking out into the road. Last year I was hiking Shenandoah, Virginia. It was a planned 2-day hiking trip, myself and 2 friends. Late into the first day, one of my friends grew ill and decided to turn back. The second friend joined him, just in case it got worse. They told me to go on, and seeing as I'd been looking forward to the trip, I did. As evening approached, I came upon a clearing into the forest. On a table, surrounded by tools and several cans of spray paint, was an elaborate dollhouse. It was large, perhaps 3 feet tall. Its walls and windows were open, as if it had just been built and was drying. That lingering smell of spray paint still hung in the air around it. On the back of the house, a photo had been affixed. It was a family picture, old, perhaps taken in the 80s. Everyone in the picture looked very uncomfortable, like they didn't want to be taking the picture or were forced to. Not scared, just very uncomfortable. I left it and continued on so that I might reach my planned campsite by nightfall. The wind had picked up considerably. In the distance I heard a branch give and fall, crashing to the forest floor, startling me. I found my campsite but was a bit unnerved by the dollhouse in the middle of nowhere. I realized I didn't want to camp out in the open where whoever was working on it might stumble upon me. I had one of those little one-person tents that stand just tall enough for a person to lay down in. I set it up behind a thick stand of brush, one side blocked off by a tall stand of rocks. I was glad for this because not only was I now hidden, but the rocks effectively blocked the heavy winds, which had now turned cold as the frigid air tumbled down from the mountains at night. The sound of wind-churned forest was relaxing, and I think I fell asleep right away. Have you ever been awoken by a loud sound and you're unsure what it is exactly, but some remnant of it echoes in your mind for a moment after waking? That's what happened to me sometime later, in the pitch dark. I had the sensation that someone was near. I listened intently, trying to hear over the wind. I heard a man's voice somewhere in the distance, harsh, rapid, then becoming softer. He was too far away from me to discern what he was saying, but close enough that I could hear inflection and cadence. It sounded like a crazy person scolding himself. Then, his voice became softer, answering. As I listened, his voice grew louder and louder, until I could hear his clumsy footfalls crashing towards me. He walked by where I was camped, just several feet away from the brush that concealed me. By now my eyes had adapted somewhat to the pale moonlight, but I still couldn't make out anything more than a large, massive shape. He was probably about 6'6", heavily built. He was carrying something long beneath his arm, a rolled-up tent, I guessed. He was angrily talking about someone's face and how it haunted him. His voice then became childlike, and his conversation with himself turned to the topic of cheese and crackers. The dude was clearly off his rocker. After a moment he continued on, his voice receding until I could no longer hear him. I slept little that night afterward. At first light I booked it back the way I came, back to town, and I noted that the dollhouse was not in the clearing when I passed back by. So this happened a few years ago. I believe it was the summer going into my junior year of high school. I'd been going to sleepover camps since I was very young, and that summer was no exception. However, I was in a different option of camp this year where I would be hiking the Appalachian Trail for 2 weeks as opposed to staying on the campgrounds. This was a new experience for me, but I was very excited because I'm an adventurous person. So on this trip was me, the 2 female counselors, and 9 other girls. This happened a few days after our trip began, so we were still getting to know each other a little more, but we were also pretty comfortable around each other. We stopped for lunch around this water fountain. Our spot was on the trail, but just happened to be by a portion of the trail where a road went through. While we were eating, we all noticed one of those stereotypical creeper vans driving back and forth in the same portion of the road. None of us really said anything, but we all noticed it. After about 5 minutes of this van driving back and forth, it pulled onto the trail close to where we were eating. It just sat there. I guess we all figured the driver was lost or was looking for a bathroom because none of us said anything about it. Finally, a man got out of the car, ran up to us, and started screaming,
"Does anyone know CPR? My half-brother has the shakes."
Immediately our 2 counselors got up and ran to his van. They were gone for a few minutes and we started getting suspicious. People began saying, "I could have sworn I saw his van drive by a few times," and "If it was an emergency, why would he take the time to say half-brother?" Our counselors finally came back with these blank looks on their face. We began asking them a bunch of questions, but they wouldn't talk. This man walked up to us with these weird puppet things. It was one of those plastic statues people put on their porch for Halloween, only there was no bowl full of candy. He began asking us questions, but no one answered. We just kept eating our lunch in silence. In a creepy way, he said, "My puppet likes girls." He also told us his puppet could talk and press the button on its foot. I guess he got the hint because he went back to his car and sat there for what seemed to be an eternity. He just sat there with his door open, blasting music. Eventually he left. We quickly packed up our bags and booked it out of there. Now it wasn't outright scary, but it was just the first part of some very strange occurrences on that day. We continued our hike down the Appalachian Trail. We talked about the creepy man we encountered for a while and then began sharing scary stories until we reached our campsite. Once we reached the campsite, we set up our tents and were just hanging out. We reached the campsite pretty early that day, so there was plenty of daylight left. Being a group of teenage girls, we got bored easily and began walking around the campsite. We flirted with a group of boys until they got bored of us and eventually left. Then we decided to play a game called Elephants and Gazelles. The premise of the game is unimportant, but the game is best played with a large group of people. And it just so happens that 3 guys walk over to our group to introduce themselves, not the guys we previously were flirting with. Since they came over and seemed friendly, one of the girls in the group decided to invite them to play. And this is when things got weird. During breaks in the game, people would share personal stories and just get to know each other more, even us girls who have been talking nonstop for a few days. Out of nowhere, one of the guys reveals that 2 of them are trans. Let me put it out there that I have absolutely no problem with people changing their genders. I believe people have the right to openly be who they are. But I just had to put that out there because I think it's weird. Not that they are trans, just that it came out of nowhere. They then began to talk about how they are trying to start their own reality show about 3 trans men who live in New York, and the third member of their group who is not trans would just pretend to be on the show. Again, I just thought it was weird that they brought it up out of nowhere. I just found it kind of strange, especially since we barely knew them. Later in the game, I guess they were talking amongst themselves and start laughing loudly, and the one shouts,
That's funny because your dad is in jail.
I think everyone is just getting kind of uncomfortable at this point. To break the ice, I suppose, one of the girls begins telling them the story of the creepy puppet man we encountered earlier in the day. They start laughing and tell us it's their uncle who dropped them off earlier in the day. Eventually, they said they were tired and were returning to their tent for the evening. We were all relieved and went on with whatever it was we did. Later, when a few girls went to the bathroom, they walked past their tent. On their way to the bathroom, they said that they heard them singing Justin Timberlake songs, and on the way back, they heard one of the guys yell,
Tickle fight.
It rained very hard that night. The next morning, we woke up and their tent was nowhere in sight. We were very surprised because we typically got up around sunrise. Right before we left the campsite, I saw a piece of paper folded up on a stump near our tent. It read, We got rained on and peed our pants. We will miss all of you. The great friendships we had. Heart, the creepy guys who get no respect. I guess I just don't know what was worse. The fact that they were just weird and told us all of those things for no reason, or that they were related to that creepy puppet guy. I'm a 33-year-old female from Los Angeles. 3 years ago, my boyfriend and I, as planned for 5 years, turned 30, sold everything we owned, including my car, took his Trailblazer and decided to just travel around the States and Canada. I guess you could call us backpackers, as we tend to chase good weather, find a state park, and backcountry hike into the wilderness for a few days at a time. My brother likes to joke that we are anti-establishment hippies. We don't necessarily live off the grid, but between the two of us, we have one prepaid phone we use for emergencies or checking in with family and friends, and one MacBook which I use for work. I'm a freelance writer and content creator, and I am on retainer with a robotics company. I mostly write boring white papers on web content. The whole point of our living situation is to live debt-free and have as few bills as possible. I only use free Wi-Fi, so 1 to 2 times a week we have to go to a city with a Starbucks. This background info is only important so you know more about who we are and how simply we live. Neither of us is involved with social media and know very little about different programs like Instagram or use any apps. Last summer, we decided to do some backcountry hiking in Arkansas. It's one of those states you don't ever really hear about other hikers visiting, but we read that it had some beautiful natural landscapes, and it does. The rules of this particular park were pretty lax. We didn't need a permit. There were a few basic laws and guidelines, but there was no check-in needed. We had all the basics and had planned to do a 6-day hike, 3 in, 3 out. The whole time we were out there, we didn't see or hear another soul. But on one day, we were prepping to move off trail and find a camping spot as it was getting near dusk. 1.5 mile off trail is usually the standard for us. We took what looked like kind of an animal trail, and about half a mile out we saw a green 2-person tent. It was almost camouflaged in the foliage, so we came on it almost by accident. Some backpackers prefer privacy, others are more social. We're the more social type. We've had some great experiences camping near other backpackers, sharing stories, food, and just building relationships. We were around 30 yards away from the tent. It was zip closed, so my boyfriend shouted a greeting to make our presence known. No movement and no sound. We assumed Green Tent Guy either wasn't around or didn't want to be bothered, so we started off in a new direction to get some distance between us. We camped, never heard a peep. We moved along the next morning, completely forgetting about Green Tent Guy until nearing the end of the day, 5 on our trek back. We were again looking for a spot to camp off the trail when we came up to the green tent again. This isn't that unusual, but normally backcountry hikers keep moving, so we really weren't expecting it. The tent flap was open, so my boyfriend yells his greeting again, and nothing. My boyfriend wants to go check it out, saying it's weird and maybe someone is hurt. I didn't like the idea from the get-go, because even though we hadn't had any bad experiences personally, we've heard enough stories from other backpackers about hermits and mountain men that want privacy, carry guns, etc. But my boyfriend assured me that we'd be fine, and if all else fails, offer him some smokables to keep the peace, and we'd go on our way. As soon as we get within 20 yards of the place, the smell of decomposition is intense. My boyfriend has been hailing his greeting over the last 20 yards, and once the smell hits him, he stops and turns and says to me, "What if we find a body?" My skin crawled. I was immediately afraid. I have never seen a body before and don't want to. The closer we got to the tent, the worse the smell got. I knew for sure we were going to walk in and see some old camper's rotting corpse. What we found was worse than that. Outside the tent was a dead doe's legs, all 4 of them covered in flies. It looked like the legs had been cut most of the way and then ripped off the rest of the way. It was a mess. Inside was the body and head of the deer, but the middle portion was swaddled in a blue fleece blanket that was blood-soaked at the bottom where the legs used to be. It was lying on its side, bottom facing the tent entry. The tail had been cut off, and the orifices were covered in dried blood and a gape, like something had been penetrating it. The same with its mouth. The bottom portion was bent down at a scary broken-looking angle. The tent was open, so we could see everything without having to go inside. Not that we could have anyway, because at this point the smell was almost debilitating. There was a dirty, almost empty clear bottle of Jergens baby oil and a stained green and white fringed kitchen towel. That was it. I immediately started crying and begged him to go. All my boyfriend could muster was, "What in God's name?" And we turned and ran. We ran into the trail and jogged down for as far as we could until dusk was fully on us, and we had to set up camp. We didn't go very far off the trail and neither of us slept. We didn't start a fire or use headlamps after full dark. We just sat up whispering to each other, going over and over what we had just seen. Every little noise startled us. It was like our brains were on red alert. I kept thinking that at any moment this dead deer-having man would come back to his tent, see our footprints or something, know where we were and track us back to our tent. I've never been so scared in my entire life. Just before dawn, we tore down and started out. My boyfriend stopped at the ranger station on our way back out of the park to report what we had just seen. The ranger was a young guy around our age, and he looked as freaked out by our story as we were telling it. He wrote most of it down, and my boyfriend showed him on a map approximately where it had been. We asked if he knew how the deer was killed, and at that point we hadn't even thought about it. We just assumed it had been shot, but because of the blanket, we didn't see a wound, but we weren't exactly giving it an autopsy either. We have since shortened our backcountry hikes to a maximum of 4 days. We've also been a lot less eager to call out to other campsites, and had never approached another unmanned tent again. This happened about 6 years ago. I was about 12 and my brother was 26 at the time. My brother had been serving in the U.S. Army for several years when this happened and was deploying to the Middle East on his second deployment, if I remember correctly. Also of note was that he is a Green Beret and had recently, 3 or 4 months prior to this trip, completed the Army Special Forces qualification course, Robin Sage and all that, and by then was an active duty Special Forces engineer sergeant. Definitely not someone you want to mess around with. Given that we both grew up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama, the Sipsey Wilderness for those unfamiliar with the area, before he left for 9 months. The trip had gone smoothly up until the 3rd night we were camping out. Around 8 p.m. we had our camp set up, eaten dinner, and were sitting by the fire talking about typical boy crap like guns and girls. For some reference, our spot was about 50 yards from a large stream and about 50 yards downhill adjacent to the large path. Our camp, the stream, and the path formed a triangle of sorts. This was summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark yet when two guys who looked to be in their late 20s wandered up and asked if we had seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some farther into the wilderness area and told them so. Even though they were relatively polite, my brother called them good old boys. I got a seriously creepy vibe from them. Dirty clothes, greasy hair, scraggly facial hair, etc. I think they probably looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They kinda hung out for a few minutes, maybe a little longer than they should have, looking around, asking us questions like how long we'd been out there, how long we were staying, and what looked like them kinda sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I know for sure my brother didn't, but I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours, my brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke up to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they were only about 100 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding, and I kicked my brother through my sleeping bag and asked if he was awake and had heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for the past hour or so. Just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was about to crap my pants. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither came any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs. They use the dogs to pin them down and then they shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow I managed to fall back asleep. The fact that they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think he was just trying to calm me down. Fast forward what was probably another 3 hours, around 2 a.m., I had managed to sleep pretty well after first hearing the hog hunters when I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly, saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on quick and follow me. Be as quiet as you can." My heart immediately went back to racing because I heard the dogs and voices in the distance, farther away than before, but still distinct. Not asking any questions, I did what he said, and as soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. This was a breeze for him after rucking with God who knows how much weight in the army. We snuck about 50 yards into the woods towards the junction of the path and the stream and crawled into some bushes. It was up a hill, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. I remember as we were laying there how loudly I was breathing and how quiet he was when I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol slide racking. I looked over and my brother had his pistol, an HK USP that he gave to me a few years after the story took place, and was watching the campsite and surrounding area. I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed to the campsite. The group of hunters had been steadily approaching our camp, and by this time, 30 or so minutes, had reached it. There were 5 of them and like 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, but 2 had either rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously having smelled our scent. For those of you who are backpackers and campers, nobody who comes up on a random campsite in the middle of the night with dogs and guns has good intentions. I knew this, and my brother knew this. I was scared out of my mind. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me they were talking about us, although he hadn't heard any specifics either. They lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to themselves. My brother put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come towards, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop. Don't look back. Stay off the trail and look for the flashing lights." I didn't know what he meant by this, but that'll come later. I knew I could make it back because he taught me land nav pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me not to take the red filter off. He told me later the red filter helps preserve night vision and cuts down ambient light so it would be harder for someone to see from a distance. At this point I was so scared I almost started crying, but at the same time had a rush of adrenaline and what I think was now confidence that he thought I could handle myself. We laid there for a little while longer when, out of nowhere, they started screaming,
"Where y'all at?"
and firing into the woods at random. My brother dragged me behind the crest of the hill and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, because of our position on top of the hill, we were protected from any gunfire. They shot maybe 5 or 6 more times and then started walking back the direction they had come. They got maybe 100 yards away when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency lights flashing through the woods. Turns out my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone my family had for emergencies while I was asleep, and they had sent our Forest Service officers and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. The Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. When we saw the game warden truck, my brother signaled them with a light and pointed them in the direction the hunters had gone, and the guy sped off, shining his spotlight through the woods. As soon as they were all gone, we went back to our camp, packed up our stuff, and waited by the path for the game warden to come back, who then gave us a ride in his truck bed back to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother told me how brave I had been, and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. I asked them not to do that because I thought they might never let me go camping again. My friend was solo hiking the Appalachian Trail. Now, for those of you who don't know, this is a fairly popular trail, and there is a whole community built up around it, with beer and food made available at popular camping spots. In fact, another friend met his wife while he was solo hiking the trail, so knowing about this sense of community, my friend believed that she would be safe on her trek. For the first 3 or 4 nights, she camped with different groups of people she met along the way, and everything was fine. They camped and told stories, drank some beers, smoked, made s'mores. You know, the cliche camping activities. The first night she decided to stop and camp at a spot without anyone nearby was kind of weird. She was a little nervous, but wrote it off as nerves and the fact that she had such a good time surrounded by those other people. She spends the next 3 nights camping by herself, and each night the feelings of nervousness were getting worse and worse. It crystallized into a feeling that something was watching her. She also thinks that some of her things aren't in the exact place in the morning that she had left them in the night before, but isn't sure about that. The feeling gets so real that she purposely makes her camp with other people for the next couple nights. Feeling silly about it, she camps by herself again the next night. She doesn't know why, but the feeling is back and so severe that she calls off her attempt to solo the trail at the next town. She makes it home and makes up an excuse about spraining her ankle because she feels so ridiculous about calling off the hike due to a feeling. A couple weeks later, she is feeling nostalgic about the trip and starts going through the pictures of the hike on her digital camera, which she hasn't touched since she returned home. She sees the pictures she remembers taking of scenery and the people she met from her first days of hiking. Then, a picture of her sleeping in her sleeping bag inside her tent. Weird, but someone she met must have picked up her camera and taken the picture as a joke because she can't see anything to distinguish the night or the campsite. Then, more pictures of her asleep in her tent, and this time she recognizes the campsite as one where she was camping by herself. As she flips through more and more of these pictures, she realizes that there are pictures from every site where she camped by herself of her asleep in her tent. Needless to say, she set aside her dream of solo hiking anything. The story happened a few weeks ago on a hiking trail that my girlfriend, Lauren, and I randomly decided to take while in the Malibu area. Our original plan was to hike at a different location, but we realized that it was farther than anticipated due to traffic, so we settled with a nearby trail that we found using Yelp. After locating the entrance to the trail, we started our hike to a basically non-existent 3-tier waterfall, being that there was a drought in California. In the middle of our hike, we passed by 3 guys, 2 of them shirtless and dirty, that said hi to us, and because of that, my girlfriend joked that those guys looked shifty and were probably up to no good. For that reason, I handed my girlfriend my spare knife that I always take with me for safety measures. After we reached the fall, we turned back. As we were hiking back, we heard the sounds of leaves being moved and stomped on aggressively in the direction of the ravine by the trail. This caused us to stop and turn to look at the direction where the noise was coming from. I told Lauren, "I think a tree might be falling since there was a couple of trees that had their roots exposed, I think making it easier for them to fall." She responded by saying, "Blair, that doesn't sound like a tree falling. Shh." The swoosh, swoosh noises started getting louder and more frequent as whatever was making the noise was getting closer to where we were and sounded as if it was going to go up the ravine towards us. The minute I saw some tall plants moving as if though someone shook them near where we were, I told Lauren to run. We both started running while whatever was making the noise started chasing after us through the ravine. At one point, it sounded as if though it wanted to cut us off from the only path that leads out of the trail. In the middle of the sprint, I thought my girlfriend should be in front of me since I knew she was a sprinter and is lighter than me while I'm an endurance runner and weigh far less than her. I turned quickly and yanked her arm and pushed her in front of me and told her to keep running. As we ran away from the scene of where this happened, I did what people in horror movies do, where whoever is running keeps looking behind them to see whatever is chasing them has stopped. Big mistake, because when I looked behind me I saw a bush taller than me, I'm 5'4", move aggressively, and I just quickly turned around and ran faster. By doing this, I didn't see that there was a dip, and injured my recently recovered sprained ankle, slowing me down. Lauren slowed down, but I told her to keep going until finally she stopped. We looked around where we were and started drinking water and talked about what exactly happened. We tried to remain calm as we walked the rest of the trail, telling Lauren to take out the knife I gave her while I took out my dinky pocket knife. I started discussing with her if something were to happen, and she was to remain in front of me since I knew I would slow her down. We both agreed that she would be able to reach for help faster than I could while I hold up a fight better since I practiced martial arts. As we walked the rest of the trail, I joked to Lauren that this type of crap is where your sprinter genes come in handy. And at that moment, Lauren sprinted as we heard the swoosh swoosh noise again. We ran as fast as we could away from whatever was following us. This part makes me laugh as when we were running down the trail, up ahead we saw these two guys. Lauren had already put away her knife while I was running behind her, telling her to stop while I had the dinky pocket knife out. Right away I tried to hide the knife so I wouldn't look like some crazy chick trying to chase another trick down with a small knife. We walked the last mile out as we felt safe since we started seeing more foot traffic and people with their dogs going towards the falls. As we exited the trail and hit the streets, we drank water and discussed what the heck just went on. Lauren speculated that maybe it was one of the three guys from earlier and that one of them hid in the other side of the ravine to creep us out. To this day, we don't know exactly what it was, but the closest thing we could think of was that it could possibly have been a coyote. After researching a bit about the area, we found an article talking about how one was spotted a couple of months back. However, I don't believe it was a coyote. I just convinced Lauren that it might have been one since she gets scared easily about things like this. Whatever it was moved too quickly and heavily as it chased us until we got out of the trail. And whatever it was big. My family has some property that backs up to Carson National Forest in New Mexico. It's been in the family for years and my sister and I both spend our summers up there. It's gorgeous. Well, it is for people who lived out in far west Texas. Nice and green, cool mountain air in the summer. It was always a relief to get up there and away from the dusty ranch. My dad was ex-military and having 2 daughters, let's just say we did lots of outdoor stuff. He taught us survival skills and how to defend ourselves. We hunted and fished and did lots of camping and hiking. To us, it was always a fun time, but I guess he felt the need to pass on his skills to us. We spent several weeks in the summer up there hiking with him and exploring the old cabins, mining communities, and checking the big ditch project that was built for Red River back in the late 1800s. I think that's the correct date for that project, but I'm not sure. Anyways, it's a great place to hike with some beautiful high mountain lakes, streams, and lots of wildlife. This happened when I was in college and my younger sister was still in high school. My dad was still at home having to work and would come up every few weeks to spend time with us. We were up there with our mom and she mainly spent time in town or around the property painting. We spent our time on the Jeep trails or hiking and sleeping. It was late June, maybe early July, I think, and we had decided we were going to hike up to Lost Lake. It's one of my favorite lakes up there because if you look at it from a certain angle, it looks like a heart. We set off in the morning and were prepared. We both had a small pack, our water, some snacks, and we both had a small hammock we planned to set up once we got to the lake so we could just enjoy the area for a while. I will admit to being an outdoor type, and swear when it's quiet enough, you can hear the trees talk. We also both always carried a knife when we hiked. My dad always insisted we have something, just in case an accident happened or we just needed it. The hike was going good. Since the summer cabin is pretty far up the valley, we just set out on foot to the trailhead. To get to Lost Lake, you take another trail that goes up to Middle Fork Lake. Then you break off that trail for Lost Lake. We run into a few other hikers, but they were going to Middle Fork Lake, and we were pleased because it looked like we could possibly have Lost Lake all to ourselves. It's a pretty good lake with some long switchbacks at the end, but totally worth it because the lake is just beautiful and a very pretty emerald green in color. We got there and saw that we did have the lake to ourselves. We hiked around the lake and decided to hike back a bit and to find a good spot to set up our hammocks. We walked into the tree line, and first thing my sister said was,
Do you smell that?
and yup, I did. It was a dead animal with a strong scent of blood. We had both done lots of hunting and knew that smell, and that's when I saw it. It was a deer carcass, but what was around it was what disgusted me. Placed around the deer carcass in a circle were its organs, entrails, etc., but it wasn't like it was being cleaned. It's like they were placed in a certain arrangement, with little piles of rocks in between everything. Now I know how some people get disgusting with their kills, and I've had some guys try to gross me out, but I don't fall for crap like that. But this made me uneasy. It wasn't just being cleaned, it was like it was set up in a certain meaning, or it had meaning. I step back from this weird circle, and then my sister starts to say my name, but stops, because then we see the guy who had done this, and he looks like he just climbed out from inside the deer because he is covered in blood and doesn't have much clothing on. At first I thought he didn't have anything on, but honestly I didn't try to check him out much. He was standing back away from his gruesome little circle, just standing close to a group of trees that were pretty close together. He was maybe 20 feet from us. I think he was maybe trying to hide. Not for sure, but my dad had always taught us that if we ever found ourselves in a situation where we didn't feel in control, to do everything in our power to try to take control of the situation. Do something that is going to take the other person by surprise. Don't do what they expect you to do. So this was raging through my brain, and I also could tell my sister was about to freak out, so I stepped up and said,
Hey, pretty good kill you got there. Did you use a bow?
The guy just stood there, his eyes all crazy wide like he was stoked out of his brain on planet Pluto. So I'm thinking, great. We ran into a guy getting his hunt on, and he had lost it and was getting blood crazy with his deer. He was staring me down, and I was staring right back, and my sister was getting ready to run. I still don't know what came over me, but I then put my hand on my knife that I kept on my waist just to show him I wasn't completely helpless. I don't know why I did it, but something told me to let him know that I wasn't going to back down or be afraid. I kept eye contact with him. I would guess he was maybe in his early 30s, but I am bad at guessing people's ages. He was pretty dirty though. You could tell that even with all the blood he had everywhere. I started to back off, and my sister had moved behind me, so I spoke again and said,
So, you having a great hunting day?
Again, the crazy didn't say a thing, just stood there like he was a statue or something, or like he thought I couldn't see him if he didn't move or make a sound. We moved back to the lakeside again and booked it around the lake. My sister stayed up front, and she was shaking pretty bad. I was mainly angry at first because he wanted to get all crazy in the woods with his deer, then he should have gone further back up the forest. We get back to the trailhead and stopped to get our bearing and looked at each other. I was scanning the forest line to make sure we weren't being followed, and my sister was just in shock. We started down the trail pretty fast, and I was hoping I could keep my sister together until we could at least reach the Middle Fork Lake Trail, or that we could even run into some more hikers. But the odds weren't good on this particular trail because you have to get an early start on the Lost Lake Trail, and by now it was late morning, almost noon. We were making good time and hadn't discussed what we saw, just started hiking back down. I started to get that feeling when you just know you aren't alone. I kept checking but didn't see anything or even hear anything at first. My sister refused to look back and just kept going, but I felt that I had to keep checking to make sure the idiot wasn't following us. That's when the first stuff came flying at us. It was some small pebbles, but it really made me angry because it was obvious someone was throwing them at us, and it could have only been him. My sister was almost running at this point, but I am the mouthy smart aleck. I blame the Texas upbringing, and darn it, this was my forest. I had grown up here, and these were my lakes, my trails, and I wasn't about to let some crazy dude ruin it for me. I started yelling back that he needed to go back to his deer and leave us alone. At this point, my sister is telling me to shut up and just come on, and I am thinking, no way, this guy is just trying to scare us. The pebbles stopped, and then we started hearing barking and growling noises. My sister said,
Now he's growling at us?
And I just told her to get on down the trail and ignore it. He was behind us pretty much the whole way, growling and making these barking noises every once in a while, but I never caught a glimpse of him. Once we get close to where the trail joined in with Middle Fork Trail, he seemed to back off. I never caught sight of him behind us, but I could hear him, and I just knew he was there. He started down the rest of the trail. My sister refused to stop or look behind her, so I kept checking every so often. Didn't see anything or hear anything. We started to discuss what had happened, and she felt like he was very sinister and felt like we had been in a dangerous situation. I felt like he was just getting his kicks out of scaring two girls. I mean, he had to have heard us coming around the lake. We weren't being quiet. It was the opposite because there are black bears up there, and we would always be pretty loud while hiking, hoping to scare off any bear in the area so we wouldn't come up on one. To this day, she still thinks he was sinister, and I think he was just trying to scare two girls and was getting his kicks out of it. We told our parents, and my dad didn't like what he had heard. He did teach us some more up-close defense skills after that day, and forbade us from ever hiking alone or just the two of us again. We didn't hike up that trail for several years with anyone. It freaked my sister out, and I just didn't like remembering a time I was scared in the forest that I considered my own. I didn't know it at the time, but after we had gotten back to the house and told my mom, she had called some neighbors, and a few of the men hiked up there the next day to check things out. They did find the deer carcass and some empty hiking packs like what day hikers use, but they were empty. They also found a rustic campsite further back in the woods that had been cleared out as well. No sign of the weirdo. Hey guys, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these stories and wish to support me further, please consider joining Patreon, where for only $1 or more a month, you can get early access to MP3s of all the future narrations and many other cool rewards. So, yeah, we'll see you there. Thanks again, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.